June 9th, 1944. South of Saint-Lô, Normandy. Morning fog clings to the hedgerows, like ghosts unwilling to leave the battlefield. The dew is thick on the boots of American infantry as they advance cautiously along a narrow dirt road. Somewhere ahead, the enemy watches from behind tangled green, well hidden, well armed, and waiting for the moment to strike. Inside an M3 half-track rumbling near the front of the column, Corporal James "Red" Hartley adjusts his grip on the twin handles of his Browning M2 .50 50 caliber machine gun. The weapon towers like a guardian atop the armored frame, dark, massive, and ready. Hartley's gloves are damp, not from sweat, but from last night's rain. The barrel's surface still holds a chill, but the belt-fed weapon is warm from use. This isn't the first time it's spoken. His sergeant shouts, "Movement!" 12 o'clock. And that's all it takes. The Browning's thunder breaks the morning quiet. Not a high-pitched chatter like the German MG-42, but a slow, deliberate growl, deep, brutal, unmistakable. The half-inch rounds tear through hedgerow and earth, each shot a hammer blow. Dirt erupts in fountains, tree trunks splinter, and whatever moved ahead stops moving. A German MG nest, hidden in a barn loft, opens fire in reply, tracer rounds stitching the air. But Hartley's second burst silences it before the loader even gets a third belt in. The barn window explodes in flame and dust. 3 more half-tracks open up with their 50s. The sound is overwhelming, a rolling thunder of steel. It's not just one machine gun, it's a wall of firepower, coordinated, sustained, and horrifyingly effective. From the other side of the hedgerow, Oberst Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division watches the carnage unfold. He had ordered a small delaying action here, hoping to stall the American column and regroup near Saint-Lô. But now his men, some of his best, are either pinned or gone. "This isn't the America we trained to fight," he says quietly to his adjutant, binoculars still to his eyes. They don't maneuver. They erase. For the Germans, the .50 caliber wasn't just a machine gun. It was a psychological shock. They had never faced an enemy who wielded heavy weapons with such casual frequency. It seemed every American vehicle, truck, tank, or plane, had one, and when it spoke, it didn't ask for permission. At 800 rounds per minute, the Browning M2 didn't just suppress, it overwhelmed. Its range was nearly a mile, and its slugs punched through sandbags, concrete, and even the thinner armor plating of light vehicles. It chewed up anything unlucky enough to be in its path, and left behind a silence that felt permanent. Later that night, as Hartley rests beside his half-track under a starlit sky, he scribbles a line into his pocket notebook. "The Krauts don't charge us like they used to. Not after today." He doesn't know it yet, but what he felt, what the Germans saw, will repeat itself from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, across the Rhine. Wherever the Americans go, the .50 goes too, and it never whispers. July 15th, 1944. Bocage country, northern France. Dawn is just beginning to burn through the low clouds when Staff Sergeant John McBride leans over the hood of a Willys Jeep parked near a crumbling stone wall. His boots are caked with mud, his .45 slung low at the hip. But it's the long barrel bolted to the Jeep's pintle mount that tells the real story. An M2 Browning, belt-fed and ready. He lights a cigarette with shaking fingers. He's been awake since 0400, watching the engineers sweep for mines while the rest of the convoy bunches up behind him. His buddy, Lopez, tightens the bolt on the .50's cradle and says, "Doesn't matter if we're in a Jeep, a truck, or a goddamn canoe. This thing's coming with us." McBride chuckles. But it's true. The Browning M2 wasn't just a heavy machine gun. It had become part of the American identity on the battlefield. On tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, bombers, fighters, landing craft, and observation posts. If it rolled, flew, or floated, odds were it had a 50 cal riding shotgun. To the Germans, this ubiquity felt unfair. They'd built their weapons with a surgeon's precision, the MG-42 with its blistering rate of fire, the 80 mm with devastating accuracy. But the Americans? They built weapons that just worked, over and over. In mud, in dust, in snow. The M2 didn't jam, didn't overheat like the MG-34, didn't choke when dragged through a swamp. It wasn't elegant. It was relentless. From the reports of General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Lehr division faced the brunt of American firepower near St. Lo, our forward scouts were cut down by fire we could not match. It seemed that every vehicle carried a cannon, yet none of them were what we would call artillery. This 50 they use, it does the work of a field gun, but never sleeps. And that's exactly what American doctrine had intended. The 50 wasn't designed just for infantry support. It was an anti-aircraft weapon, an anti-vehicle gun, a long-range suppressor, and a convoy defender, all wrapped in one simple, brutally effective machine. Up in the sky, bomber crews trusted the 50 cal with their lives. Flying Fortress gunners on B-17s and B-24s fired thousands of rounds per mission, forming steel boxes of fire to keep enemy fighters at bay. A Luftwaffe pilot attacking a bomber formation didn't face a single shot. He flew into dozens of converging streams of 50 caliber rounds, each one capable of punching through aircraft frames, armor, and flesh. Many never made a second pass. Down below, Sherman tanks bristled with them. M2s atop their turrets swept tree lines, shattered ambushes, and discouraged even the bravest Panzerfaust teams from getting too close. Engineers in M3s used them to rake buildings clean of snipers. Convoys driving through ambush country in Belgium kept one man always facing outward, his hands on the butterfly triggers of a Browning. Even the Americans themselves were sometimes surprised by what it could do. One after-action report from a field unit noted, "Engaged enemy light armored car at 400 yards. Armor was pierced clean. Gunner says he didn't even change belts." But it wasn't just the firepower that unnerved German commanders. It was the sheer scale. The United States didn't field the M2 in moderation. They fielded it by the hundreds of thousands. By war's end, nearly 2 million Browning 50 caliber machine guns had been produced, and every one of them had its place in the U.S. order of battle. For German infantrymen, it meant that American fire superiority wasn't theoretical. It was deafening, sustained, and everywhere at once. Every exposed movement invited the growl of the 50. Every hedgerow crossing risked being cut down before a rifle could even be raised. The message was clear. You cannot hide. You cannot outrun it. And while American soldiers respected the German MG-42, even feared it at times, it was the M2 that made the enemy feel helpless. The Germans called the MG-42 Hitler's buzzsaw. But behind closed doors, more than one Wehrmacht officer admitted they'd rather charge a squad with rifles than face a column of GIs protected by the Browning. Back at the edge of that muddy French road, McBride slaps the side of the Jeep and calls out, "Convoy's moving." The 50 cal hums gently as the barrel warms in the rising sun. It'll be fired again before noon. It always is. August 17th, 1943. Over Schweinfurt, Germany. The sky is a brutal place at 25,000 feet. The temperature drops to 30 below, oxygen masks fog with each breath, and even the sun feels distant, pale and cold. But for the men of the 91st Bomb Group flying deep over Nazi Germany, it's not the cold that matters. It's the swarms of fighters rising to meet them. Sergeant William Billy Gaines, A top turret gunner on a B-17F, nicknamed Liberty Bell, braces himself as the formation tightens. Dozens of flying fortresses line the sky in staggered boxes. Each plane bristles with 13 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, one in every direction. The entire squadron moves like a slow, defiant wall. Then the radio crackles. Bandits, high at 2 o'clock, Focke-Wulfs. From the edge of the formation, dark shapes slice through the horizon. FW-190s dive toward the lead elements, guns blazing. The air fills with tracer fire, orange and red streaks clawing through the thin atmosphere. But the Americans are not flying blind. As soon as the enemy closes in, the 50s open up, in pairs, in clusters, sometimes all at once. The sound is not sharp or erratic. It's rhythmic, controlled, thunderous. Gaines squeezes the butterfly triggers and lets his turret rotate with the attack. The barrels flash, casing after casing clatters down through the floor chute. The recoil pulses through his arms like a heartbeat. Below him, the ball turret gunner tracks another fighter. At the waist positions, 2 more gunners shout warnings over the intercom as their Brownings fire in alternating bursts. It's coordinated, practiced, relentless. The German pilot trying to line up a shot on Liberty Bell never makes it to firing range. His canopy shatters under a direct hit, the aircraft bucking violently before spiraling into cloud. This is what German pilots learned quickly. Attacking an American bomber box meant flying into a storm of .50 caliber rounds. From dozens of angles, from hundreds of guns. It wasn't luck, it was doctrine. American strategic bombing theory relied on mass formations flying daylight missions with heavy defensive armament. No escort fighters had the range to reach Schweinfurt or Regensburg yet. So the 50 cal wasn't just a gun. It was the bomber's lifeline, its shield, its voice. Each B-17 carried over 5,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Multiply that by a 300-plane raid, and you get over 1 million rounds of fury ready to pour downrange on every mission. The sky became a battlefield of firepower density unlike anything seen before in warfare. German ace pilot Oberleutnant Dieter Gerhardt described it in his combat diary. We would dive on the bombers and immediately be hit by tracers from 6 directions. The fire from their machine guns stitched the air with such precision, it was as if the planes could see into our thoughts. Indeed, while the Luftwaffe developed complex attack formations and dive patterns to minimize exposure, the American gunners learned to anticipate them. Waist gunners were taught to watch for coordinated head-on runs. Tail gunners were trained to feint in response to flanking moves, and the gunners communicated, across planes, across squadrons, adjusting their fire with terrifying discipline. By late 1943, the 50 cal wasn't just protecting bombers. It was shaping Luftwaffe tactics. German fighter wings began to hesitate. Pilots knew they had seconds, sometimes less, to fire and break off before flying into a curtain of armor-piercing bullets. Some refused to attack head-on at all, despite orders. Others requested escort by Mi-110 heavy fighters just to survive the return flight. But no statistic speaks louder than this. More than half of Luftwaffe fighter losses during major raids came from bomber defensive fire. Not from dogfights, not from flak. From the 50s mounted by 19-year-olds in leather gloves and frozen boots, braving the thin air in unpressurized cabins. Back inside Liberty Bell, Gaines watches another FW-190 tumble in flames. He doesn't cheer, he just reloads. The belt slides into place with a metallic snap. Another burst of gunfire shakes the fuselage. They still have 300 miles to go. But as long as the Brownings keep singing, they have a fighting chance. September 14th, 1944. Near Aachen, Germany. The ground shakes even before the engine roar reaches the ears of the German infantry. Somewhere behind the treetops, a familiar whine builds. Not the thunder of artillery, but something faster, more precise. Seconds later, two dark silhouettes scream over the tree line. P-47 Thunderbolts, winged beasts armed not with bombs, but with Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Sergeant Dieter Holtz of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division throws himself face down in a foxhole just as the Thunderbolts open fire. The sound is unmistakable. 8 M2s per plane, delivering a combined rate of fire over 4,000 rounds per minute. Dirt erupts around him. Tree limbs snap like twigs. A half-track behind the lines bursts into flame without warning, its fuel tank shredded by armor-piercing incendiary slugs. From the cockpit of the lead P-47, Lieutenant Carl Duke Brewster keeps his eyes on the target. He doesn't need bombs today, just the .50 calibers singing beneath his wings. His voice crackles over the radio. 2 hits on the half-track, second pass coming in low. This was what made the M2 so terrifying from the air: accuracy, volume, and flexibility. Mounted in batteries of 4 per wing on planes like the P-47 or P-51 Mustang, the .50 cal wasn't just a support weapon. It was a force of nature. Against trucks, rail cars, horse-drawn artillery, staff cars, and even lightly armored vehicles, it was devastating. By mid-1944, American ground attack pilots had rewritten the playbook on air power. Where Germans had relied on cannons and precision dive bombing, the U.S. often chose quantity over complexity, and nothing embodied that, like the Flying 50s. Convoys in France, Poland, and the Low Countries dreaded the sound of the Thunderbolt's approach. Unlike the shrieking Stuka, which announced itself with psychological flair, the P-47 moved in low and fast, its only warning a split-second crackle before it sprayed an entire road segment with a hellstorm of fire. General der Fallschirmtruppe Alfred Schlemm, commanding German forces during the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, later noted in a captured report, "We can no longer rely on movement during daylight hours. Even the lightest column draws fire from these American planes. They do not drop bombs. They rip us apart with their flying machine guns." The ground troops felt it too. Supply lines became nightmares. Horses were cut down by the dozens, their wagons overturned. Rail networks were dismantled one boxcar at a time. Bridges, depots, and intersections all became free fire zones. In one field near Mons, Belgium, a group of retreating German engineers was ambushed by 2 P-51s. Survivors reported that the aircraft didn't need rockets. They merely made 3 passes. And by the time the engines faded, the road was a graveyard of splintered wheels, shattered helmets, and burning tarpaulins. Back in the skies, the American pilots trusted the M2s like old friends. They rarely jammed, even after long sorties. They could fire armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, sometimes mixed in belts for maximum disruption. And most importantly, they were easy to maintain. Ground crews loved them. Pilots relied on them. And the enemy learned to fear them. Even the famed German Tiger tank, invulnerable to the 50's bite from the front, wasn't safe from the sky. A .50 cal burst into the engine grills or turret hatch could knock out soft components, set fuel ablaze, or kill exposed crew. It wasn't about destroying the tank. It was about disabling the war machine long enough for infantry or artillery to finish the job. The doctrine was clear: disrupt, disorient, and dominate. No rest for the enemy. No safe zones. Even a handful of GIs with a tripod-mounted 50 on a hill could deny movement to an entire battalion if the terrain favored them. As Brewster pulls up from his second pass, he watches smoke rise from a burning troop transport. He radios in casually. Target neutralized. Fuel dump hit. Winchester on ammo, returning to base. He doesn't celebrate. He just banks the aircraft and disappears into the cloud bank, the smell of cordite still hanging in the cockpit. Below, the German survivors crawl out from ditches and smoking tree lines, shaken. The steel rain has passed, for now. But it always comes back. December 19th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow is falling hard now, thick flakes swirling in wind that cuts through wool and canvas. Somewhere ahead, muffled by the pines, a low rumble rolls through the white silence. It's not tanks, it's engines, trucks. A U.S. supply convoy, slowly winding its way through the icy roads west of Bastogne. Private Leonard Simmons grips the handles of the Browning M2 mounted atop his M3 half-track. His breath fogs the steel receiver as he scans the tree line. The convoy stretches for over a mile, trucks hauling ammo, fuel, food, and blankets for the surrounded 101st Airborne. And every man in it knows one thing. Somewhere out there, German patrols are hunting. Then it happens. A flash of yellow in the trees. The sharp bark of a Panzerfaust. One of the lead trucks erupts in flame, blocking the road. Screams follow. Machine gun fire rakes the rear vehicles. The forest explodes with sound. Ambush. Simmons doesn't hesitate. He swings the .50 cal toward the muzzle flashes and squeezes the triggers. The Browning comes to life with its signature roar, each round cracking through the frozen air like thunder. Trees splinter. Snow explodes off branches. Somewhere out there, a German MG nest goes quiet. In moments like these, the M2 isn't just a weapon. It's a lifeline. Throughout the Battle of the Bulge, when roads became battlegrounds and German units infiltrated American lines dressed in U.S. uniforms, the Browning 50 served as the backbone of vehicle defense. Convoys too slow to run, roads too narrow to turn. In those frozen forests, it came down to who could fire first and faster. The Germans had feared the weapon before. Now, in close terrain with little cover, that fear deepened. One Besvik 50 cal on a bend in the road could stop a whole column, and the Americans knew it. Field reports from Bastogne tell of engineers and clerks grabbing tripods and mounting M2s on rooftops, church towers, and even snowbanks. Improvised anti-armor teams set up along likely German routes. Though not intended as a tank killer, the 50's armor-piercing rounds could tear through the sides of light vehicles, motorcycle scouts, and even disable the optics and external components of heavier tanks. In one skirmish near Saint-Vith, a recon jeep crew used a Browning to knock out 2 Kübelwagens and send a group of SS Panzer Grenadiers diving into a frozen ditch. The after-action report read simply, "Ambush broken. 0 American casualties. 50 cal effective as primary deterrent." It wasn't just about brute force. It was about reach. The M2 could suppress at distances the MG-42 struggled to match. In open snowfields, it could pin enemy positions before they came within effective rifle range. And mounted on vehicles, it offered flexibility unmatched by man-portable systems. As the siege of Bastogne tightened, M2s were rotated between units like gold, carried from destroyed tanks to new hulls, from abandoned trucks to hastily dug positions. The sound of one Browning opening up in the distance often signaled where the line held, or where it was about to be broken. German prisoners captured after the siege spoke of the psychological toll. You feared the cold. You feared the sky. But most of all, you feared the 50. It came from everywhere. For Private Simmons, pinned behind his half-track with the engine smoking and the road still blocked, That fear translates into momentum. His barrel glows red. He slaps in a fresh belt with frozen hands, teeth chattering, ears ringing. But the ambush is breaking. German figures move in retreat now, shadows slipping back through the woods. Simmons fires again, short, controlled bursts. One last scream of metal, then silence. All that remains is the smoke rising over the snow, the wrecked truck smoldering, and the dull hiss of winter wind pushing through shattered pines. They'll dig the trucks out, patch up the wounded, keep moving, because Bastogne still needs supplies, and the 50 is still speaking. January 10th, 1945. New Haven, Connecticut. Inside the vast halls of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, the air smells of oil, steel, and hot metal. Conveyor lines clatter endlessly, sparks leap from lathes. Men in grease-streaked coveralls guide heavy machinery with practiced hands, while rows of women with hair tucked into scarves sit at assembly benches, their fingers dancing with bolts, springs, and feed trays. They're building Brownings. By the time the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, America's industrial war machine had reached full stride. And at its core, quietly and relentlessly, was the M2 50 caliber machine gun, produced by the hundreds of thousands. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it never stopped arriving at the front. In this factory alone, over 500 M2s would be finished by sundown, every day. That was the American answer to German engineering. Not fewer, finer weapons, but mass production, reliability, and overwhelming logistics. The M2's design allowed it to be mounted on tanks, trucks, planes, ships, and ground tripods. It used a standardized cartridge, the 50 BMG, produced in billions. From the moment the war began, the U.S. didn't just plan to field the 50 cal. It planned to bury the enemy in its firepower. At the Remington plant in Bridgeport, entire floors were dedicated to ammo production. Machines spit out cartridges faster than the eye could track. One factory floor supervisor, Harold Bishop, remarked to a journalist from Yank, the Army Weekly, "The Germans may have their aces and their tactics. We've got belts, miles of them." He wasn't wrong. By 1945, the U.S. had produced more than 2.5 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. That's enough for every Browning in service to fire continuously for hours. And they did. From Sicily to Saipan, from the skies over Berlin to the jungles of Burma. Even in training, the M2 was present everywhere. Recruits learned to load, fire, and disassemble it blindfolded. In every theater of war, the gun became a kind of mechanical companion, not just a tool, but a symbol. Marines called it Medusa, half respecting, half fearing it. GIs joked that it could kill the breeze if you fired it high enough. Navy gunners used it to sweep kamikaze planes from the sky, and bomber crews polished their barrels like Lucky Charms. And yet, few ever saw the hands that built them. Back in New Haven, 23-year-old Ruth Donnelly wipes sweat from her brow with a sleeve, then locks a breech block into a newly finished receiver. Her fiancé is somewhere in the Pacific, manning a quad mount on an LST. She doesn't know where. But every time she tightens a screw, she imagines him behind the gun, alive because it works. The workers take pride in numbers, in function, not in headlines. They don't design fancy optics or aerodynamic shells. They build a gun that works in the cold, the mud, the sky, or the jungle. One that American soldiers can trust. One that terrifies the enemy, not because it's complicated, but because it always shows up. General George S. Patton once reportedly remarked that the M1 Garand was the greatest battle implement ever devised. But among his armored units, another weapon earned quiet reverence. The 50 cal riding high atop the tank, leading every push, finishing every fight. At a logistics briefing in early January, a quartermaster officer summarized the situation bluntly. "We'll win this war with gasoline, spare parts, and 50 calibers." He wasn't wrong. Without the factories, the M2 was just a blueprint. But with them, with the endless crates, the packed rail cars, the dockyards flooded with green metal and ammunition belts, it became more than a machine gun. It became a constant presence. Every click of a press in New Haven sent a ripple across the Atlantic. Every packed crate had someone's name on it, even if they never knew it. Every Browning shipped meant someone, somewhere, would live to see another sunrise. February 9th, 1945. Perimeter of an American field hospital, Rower River Sector, Germany. The wind blows low and steady across the frozen plain, rattling canvas and shaking the makeshift fencing. A few scattered lanterns cast amber halos, their light diffused through drifting snow. In the shadows between them, two soldiers huddle around a Browning M2 mounted on a sandbag tripod, scanning the darkness with tired eyes. Private First Class Harold Skinny Brenner wipes the frost off the receiver housing and checks the feed belt for the third time that hour. Beside him, Corporal Paul Taggart doesn't say much, just sips slowly from a canteen of coffee, long gone cold. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the war waits. Behind them, less than 100 yards away, stretch rows of white tents marked with red crosses. Inside, nurses move from cot to cot. Surgeons scrub in silence. Wounded men mutter in half-sleep, caught between morphine and memory. The Browning is the only thing standing between them and whatever might come from that tree line. The 50 cal had become more than a weapon. It was a sentinel. By 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Browning was everywhere. Mounted on guard towers, dug into foxholes, perched atop command trucks, and lashed to the sides of makeshift outposts. It had become the backbone of American perimeter defense, especially at night. The Germans knew it too. Skirmish teams from the Waffen-SS and Fallschirmjäger began launching probing attacks in darkness. Swift, silent raids meant to capture prisoners, destroy fuel dumps, or slip behind the lines. But when they encountered the deep, rhythmic roar of a Browning opening up in the dark, most never got close enough to finish their mission. One after-action report from the 99th Infantry Division reads, "Enemy night patrol intercepted at 300. Browning M2 opened fire at 350 yards. Estimated 3 KIA, 1 wounded. No breach of line, no friendly casualties." There was something about the 50 at night. The deep, staccato crack, slower than the MG-42, but far more commanding. The noise echoed across hills and fields. It wasn't just a warning. It was a statement. You're not getting past this line. Corporal Taggart leans forward and adjusts the angle of the tripod. "It's always the same," he says. "They test the edges. Try to sneak in, think we're asleep, then the 50 lets them know." Brenner doesn't answer. He just watches the woods. Back at the aid station, Lieutenant Ellen Monroe folds a blanket over a young lieutenant fresh from the Siegfried line. His leg is gone. His dog tags are clutched in his hand like a talisman. She hears the burst of the Browning echo through the trees and doesn't flinch. She's heard it too many times, and every time it means someone's watching. Even German prisoners later spoke of its psychological presence. One officer captured near the Ruhr told interrogators, "We feared the aircraft during the day, but at night, it was the 50s, always the 50s. We would hear them begin, and we knew any approach was suicide." Unlike other weapons, the M2 didn't need special positioning. Its range meant it could dominate open fields, hilltops, or roadways. Its stopping power meant that even the toughest German armored scout cars thought twice before rolling into view. And its reliability meant it could sit, exposed to wind and ice, for days, and still fire the moment the butterfly trigger was pulled. It was less a piece of gear and more a guardian. By late war, many U.S. units rotated their 50 cal gunners in shifts, not because of maintenance, but because the responsibility was crushing. These men didn't sleep during their watch. They listened. They counted footsteps. They read the wind. One mistake, and a whole camp could pay the price. Back on the perimeter, Brenner sees a flicker in the distance, maybe a shadow, maybe a deer. His hands go instinctively to the grips. The gun pivots, belt humming in place, but no shot comes. Not yet. Taggart whispers, "How many belts we got?" "7 loaded, 2 dry." Taggart nods. That's enough. If something comes, the Browning will speak first and loudest. They sit in silence again, the only sound the click of cooling metal and the faint hum of a generator in the distance. The front line may move, the weather may change, but this weapon, this sound, is constant. March 3rd, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. The black sand burns under the sun, even though it's barely past noon. Heat waves shimmer above the volcanic ash, and the smell of cordite, diesel, and blood hangs over the battlefield like smoke from a funeral pyre. Corporal Raymond Tex Holloway crouches behind the turret of his M4 Sherman. Its olive-drab paint barely visible beneath layers of grime and dust. The turret hatch is open, and beside it, bolted firm and steady, is the Browning M2. The barrel's hot. Spent casings litter the deck like brass confetti. Tex doesn't mind. He's still alive, and he knows why. Ahead, pillboxes carved into the hillside continue to spit fire. The Japanese defenders aren't running. They don't retreat. They stay underground, emerge in bursts, and vanish like ghosts. But the Americans are ready for that now. The 50 cal isn't just a machine gun here. It's the only thing fast enough and brutal enough to stop a surprise attack before it turns into a massacre. From landing beaches to jungle clearings, from coral ridges to mountain caves, the Browning M2 followed the Marines across every island. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and now Iwo. It was mounted on Amtraks, churning through surf, lashed to Higgins boats landing in waves, braced atop tanks pushing into volcanic craters. Wherever the Marines went, the 50 cal was there. Ripping through palm trees, cracking through bunkers, sweeping caves with fire so fierce it turned night into day. Tex had seen it all. He'd watched a lone M2 clear a cave entrance on Okinawa where flamethrowers had failed. He'd seen it knock down a sniper's perch so precisely the wooden beams fell like matchsticks. He'd used it to protect medics pulling wounded off a beachhead while mortar rounds fell like rain. But Iwo Jima was different. The Japanese had turned this rock into a fortress. Machine gun nests, hidden mortars, mines, and tunnel networks that defied logic, all dug into sulfurous stone. And yet, the Marines kept pushing forward, one dune at a time, one ridge at a time, with the Browning clearing the way. The 50 cal wasn't just used against enemy positions. It also neutralized threats in the open. Kamikaze troops with grenades, light trucks ferrying reinforcements between caves, boats trying to escape at night. Nothing moved above ground without being seen, and nothing that was seen could outrun the reach of the Browning. Even in the worst terrain imaginable, the weapon never failed. Mud didn't stop it. Rain didn't choke it. Sand tried. But with a quick clean and a steady hand, It always came back to life. Navy Seabees mounted them on bulldozers. Forward observers set them atop makeshift platforms. On one occasion during the Leyte campaign, a Marine patrol rigged an M2 to a salvaged aircraft mount and used it to protect a field airstrip from night raids. The next morning, 11 enemy bodies lay in a semicircle 200 yards from the wire. Tex grips the handles again. Another burst from a ridge, a flash of muzzle. He pivots, steadies, and fires. The barrel jumps. The mountain face spits dust and rock. A scream rises, then nothing. He releases the trigger, breathing hard. Below, a medic drags a wounded Marine behind cover. Tex nods to him. They both know, without that gun, neither one of them makes it off this rock. At night, the Browning takes on a new role. Mounted atop sandbagged positions near the beachhead, it watches the water. Patrol boats cut silent wakes. Torches flicker on enemy-held ridgelines. And every now and then, someone tries to slip through the darkness. They don't make it far. A single burst across the surf is enough to light up the night like a 4th of July finale. And the sound, that low, thudding roar, tells every Marine trying to sleep on a cot or in a shell hole that someone is still watching. That line still holds. Back at the edge of Motoyama Airfield, a group of engineers unload another case of 50 cal belts from a Navy LST. They'll be spent by morning. Tex rests his head against the steel turret and closes his eyes for a moment, fingers still curled around the grips. Tomorrow, the fight moves inland, and the Browning's not done yet. April 1st, 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands. The ocean smells like salt, oil, and gunpowder. Dozens of American ships stretch across the horizon like steel giants, destroyers, cruisers, LSTs, and troop transports, all converging on the last major stepping stone before Japan itself. But it's the decks that tell the real story. Every railing, every crow's nest, every corner bristling with Browning 50 caliber machine guns. Seaman First Class Eddie Marquez grips the handles of his twin-mounted M2s aboard the USS Hinsdale, an attack transport ship stationed just outside the landing zone. His flak vest is tight, his helmet digs into his brow. He's been at his post since before dawn. And he's not alone. Every man on deck is locked in, eyes scanning the sky, the waves, the shoreline, because they know what's coming. At 8:30 hours, the first wave of landing craft makes for the beaches of Okinawa. Marines crouch behind armor plates on Higgins boats, the 50 cals mounted at their bows, already spinning up. They haven't touched land, but they're already laying down suppressive fire, raking cliffs, caves, and possible sniper nests as they inch toward the sand. Then the air changes. A high-pitched whine breaks through the rumble of engines. Someone yells, "Incoming! Port side!" Kamikazes. 2 Japanese planes plunge out of the clouds, engines screaming, one headed straight for a nearby destroyer. Without hesitation, a dozen 50s erupt from the decks, barking fire into the sky. Tracers arc in orange-red streaks, slamming into the approaching Zero. The plane shudders, wings shattering, fuel igniting mid-air. It breaks apart just 50 yards from the hull. The second kamikaze gets closer. Too close. Eddie opens fire, both barrels blazing, brass casings flying across the deck like hail. The Browning doesn't miss. Bullet after bullet rips through the fuselage until the aircraft veers, clips the sea wall, and explodes in a white-hot blast just off the starboard side. Salt water sprays the deck. Eddie's heart pounds. The barrel smokes. But the ship still floats. The Marines still land. The gun still fires. This was the Pacific War. Unpredictable, savage, and fought in 360 degrees. On the water, Every second counted. There were no foxholes on a ship. Your best protection was how fast you spotted the enemy and how fast the 50 cal could get to work. By 1945, the M2 Browning was standard equipment on nearly every U.S. Navy vessel, from patrol boats to aircraft carriers. On larger ships, it supplemented heavier guns, filling in the gaps where the 20mm Oerlikons and 5-inch cannons couldn't pivot fast enough. But on smaller craft, LSTs, landing craft, gunboats, the M2 was the main line of defense. During amphibious assaults, these guns created suppressive fire curtains, shredded floating mines, and tore through enemy swimmers, sampans, and suicide boats. On one occasion during the Luzon campaign, a Navy PT boat armed with twin 50s spotted a Japanese supply barge trying to sneak past under moonlight. A 2-minute engagement ended with the barge sunk and the shoreline erupting into secondary explosions. Not a single torpedo fired, just twin Brownings, steady and exact. Even the Coast Guard cutters, tasked with rescue and patrol, mounted 50 cals on their decks. They weren't looking for glory. They were watching the water for threats, ready to lay down fire if it meant saving lives. Eddie reloads. The metal belt clinks into place. His arms are tired, and his back aches from hours on post, but he doesn't flinch. Across the water, another transport takes a glancing hit from a diving bomber. Flames rise. Damage control crews swarm. But on the edge of the deck, the Browning stays manned. Smoking, ready, unshaken. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, thousands of kamikaze attacks had tested the limits of the fleet. Hundreds of ships were damaged. Dozens were sunk. But many more were saved by the steady hands of gunners like Eddie, by the weapon that barked back against desperation. The M2 didn't just defend the sky, it made sure the landing went on, that the wounded came home, that the flag stayed upright, no matter the cost. As the sun dips behind the island, casting long shadows over the smoking beachhead, Eddie wipes the sweat from his eyes and stares towards shore. Tomorrow, they go again, and the 50 will still be there. May 8th, 1945, Reims, France. The war in Europe is over. In a small room inside a red brick schoolhouse, German officers sign the surrender papers beneath the stern gaze of Allied brass. Outside, the streets of Reims erupt in celebration. Flags waving, champagne flowing, soldiers hugging in disbelief. For many, the nightmare is over. But even in that moment of victory, the 50 caliber Browning stands guard. Private First Class Tom Delaney leans against his jeep just outside the command post. Mounted above him, still smudged with grime from a dozen road marches, is the same Browning M2 he's carried from Normandy to the Rhine. It's not polished. It's not ceremonial. It's still loaded. Because even when the shooting stops, the habit doesn't. Across the battlefield-turned barracks, the 50 cal remains on rooftops, at checkpoints, in turret rings, and mounted to tanks that no longer fire. It's part of the scenery now, as constant as the duffel bags and ration crates. The war didn't just make it a weapon. It made it a symbol. To the Germans, the sound of the M2 became synonymous with American presence. Overwhelming, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Luftwaffe pilots remembered its sting. Panzer commanders dreaded its reach. Infantry patrols came to fear the sudden, thunderous burst that meant they'd been spotted. From the fields of France to the caves of Iwo Jima, it carved a reputation not through innovation, but through trust. The kind of trust you only earn when a weapon fires in mud, in heat, in cold, in chaos, and just keeps firing. Back home, the factories wind down, but they don't shut. The Browning M2 doesn't fade into history. It stays in the racks. It stays on the blueprints. New models are planned, upgrades tested. Armorers at Fort Benning and Pendleton keep parts stocked. Gunners keep drilling, and doctrine keeps evolving around it. Because the military knows what history just proved. No matter how advanced warfare becomes, there's always a place for something that simply works. And over the decades, in Korea, in Vietnam, across desert roads and mountain ridges, mounted to Humvees and helicopters, the 50 cal Browning keeps showing up. 80 years after it first fired in anger, it still finds itself in the hands of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen. The ammo may be newer, the mounts might be digital, but the heart of the weapon hasn't changed. The same recoil, the same belt-fed rhythm, the same hard-earned respect. Historians would later note that while Germany produced some of the most technically advanced weaponry of the war, guided bombs, jet fighters, rocket artillery, it was America's logistical superiority, industrial scale, and dependable firepower that ground the Wehrmacht into retreat. And standing at the center of that philosophy was the M2. Not glamorous, not exotic, just dependable, just everywhere. As Tom Delaney watches a French boy climb atop a Sherman tank to wave an American flag, he can't help but look at the 50 cal once more. It's caked in dust. The paint's worn to bare metal, but it's still ready. He reaches up, pats the receiver like an old friend, and mutters with a grin, "You earned your rest." And yet, even as peace settles in, the world isn't done with war, and the Browning won't stay idle for long. It never does.